Everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yay, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone.
Still morning.
Hello.
It's still morning.
Oh, good morning. That's my number responding to. It's actually morning. All right. It's afternoon somewhere in the world, though. In Sochi, it's evening.
That's right.
So, welcome to our February Faith Forum. Glad to see that you are here today. Our topic today is changing faiths, finding God again. Only 20% of people stay in the faith in which they were raised. What precipitates changing one's faith? How does someone know when it's time to make a change? Is there a shifting of the belief system or an inner knowing that says it's time to move on? And what happens to friends and family and loved ones that are left behind in that previous faith tradition? Today, our panelists are going to relate their experiences of changing faiths. It's my privilege to be the moderator of this panel today. I'm Mitzi Linton, and I'm the Vice President of the Arizona Interfaith Movement. And we have a wonderful panel for you today. We tore up little pieces of paper just now with little numbers on, so the order has been determined very democratically. And our first panelist to speak today is Lucia Anderson. Yay! Give Lucia a round of applause. I'm going to introduce each panelist right before they speak so that you won't have to keep it all in your mind and go, now who was that? So Lucia is from the Unification Church, and she was raised in a Quaker home, followed Guru Maharaji, joined an eschatological group called the Stell Group in Chicago, accepted Jesus, and was a New Testament Christian for 3 years. Then in her late 20s, joined her current affiliation, the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, formerly known as the Unification Church. Interestingly, through her recent studies to become a spiritual director at the Franciscan Renewal Center, she's come to recognize a thread of mysticism in the Unificationist theology which connects her back to her earlier spiritual upbringing. Lucia has 4 adult children and 4 grandchildren. She and her husband, Mark, live in Mesa. And I forgot to say that how this unfolds this afternoon is each panelist will have up to 8 minutes to speak. At 7 minutes, they'll get a warning. They don't have to speak for 8 minutes. And after all the panelists have had a time to share, then it'll be over to you for any questions that you might have of our panelists. So, we're going to start with Lucia. We're sharing one mic today as well, so we're very kind here. There you go.
Thank you, Mitzi. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be here. I'd like to start by saying that Abraham was the first one who changed faiths. And quite a few faiths were spawned by his descendants. And as Mitzi said, only 20% of people remain in their birth faith. So we here actually in the majority, we're in the 80% right here. I can trace my lineage back to the Pilgrims. They changed their faith in a dramatic way, gave up everything to come to a new land. My parents both became Quakers in their early 20s, so they left the faith of their family. One of my grandfathers was a Christian Scientist, and I'm sure in those days that was a new religion, so he actually changed faiths also. So I'm at least a 2nd or 3rd generation faith changer. I was exposed to many different religions and cultures at a young age. My mother's passion was connecting Buddhism and Christianity, just for example. And one of my grandmothers was married to a congregational minister, but she loved everything about Italy, so I found books about Catholic saints in her library, which I enjoyed very much as a child. So as Quakers, my parents were very open to other cultures and other religions. And their emphasis was on the Holy Spirit and actual practice. I went to a Quaker boarding school for 3 years, so I attended unprogrammed meeting for worship every week, and we had religious studies. When I was in college, I applied for membership in the Quaker meeting of our family. So that was my first adult expression of a desire to be affiliated with a certain religious group, in this case, my birthright group. However, that quickly changed. There was a couple in the periphery of the meeting, and they were inspired by this eschatological group, the STEL group, in Chicago, which had a broad vision from the time of Lemuria and Atlantis, believing in reincarnation, up to California falling into the sea and everybody being airlifted to an island in the Pacific. So I left college, I went to Chicago, I met my first husband there, but we left the STEL group because we were disillusioned with the human problems. I was actually conceived and born in a religious intentional community that my mother started, based on the principles of Gandhi, Buddha, Jesus, Martin Luther King, St. Francis. So that's really in my blood and in my cells. However, they disbanded that community because of the interpersonal problems. So my father went on to study psychology and religion because of that other aspect. So then, for a while, we didn't have a religious affiliation. There were problems in the marriage, and so we were separated. And during that time, I became a born-again Christian in a New Testament church, and that was very meaningful. And at that time, I was living in community. They had houses for single women and single men. So that community life is a thread that I found intertwined with my spirituality. After 3 years, my husband and I reconciled. We studied the Bible, we fasted on Sundays, and we decided we would take Jesus at his word when he said to the young ruler, "Sell all that you have and come and follow me." Also, the parable of the treasure in the field. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who was digging in a field, and he found a treasure, and for the joy of finding the treasure, he sold all he had, and he bought the field." So this was really a motivator for us. We liquidated our apartment, we gave away all our cash, we took off hitchhiking across the country with our 5-year-old son with no money, from Oregon to Massachusetts, and God and people took care of us. So we landed at my parents' retreat center that they'd established in Massachusetts at the time. That marriage did not last, but shortly after that I was introduced to the Unification movement. A young man came up to me and said, "Are you interested in God?" And of course, I said yes. He invited me to a 2-day weekend workshop in upstate New York, about 2 hours away. I called several friends to say, "Am I crazy to go and do this?" They said, "No, you should go ahead." So I went to the 2-day workshop, and I stayed on for 7 days, and I decided to join. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes. Okay, let's see if I can say this. I want to share my reasons for joining, because that was part of the assignment, was, what would cause a person to make this dramatic shift. The lectures that first weekend talked about establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth. And in my 3 years in the New Testament church, I hadn't heard about talking about the kingdom of heaven on earth. But here it was being talked about, and I had already given everything for this ideal. So that was one thing that really appealed to me. Also, the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob offered everything, all his worldly possessions, even his family members, and then he even bowed down before his angry brother and said, "When I see you, I see the face of God." This was lifted up as a paradigm for conflict resolution. And so I thought, if this is really what's practiced here with surrender and unconditional love as a means to resolve conflicts, it's probably safe for me. to invest. And I wanted to invest everything. I just wanted to be able to trust and give myself totally without having to second guess and figure everything out. So that was another factor for me. Also the message that John the Baptist initially blessed his younger cousin, but he didn't follow him. He didn't become a disciple. And so I didn't want to repeat that. I was afraid of doing the same thing. So I thought I better take my opportunity here to follow the Lord. Also, there were lectures about the parallels of history, showing unmistakably the cycles, the patterns, the historical dates, showing that 1920 is the year for the second coming to appear. And I was being invited to participate in this momentous event. And then I wanted to learn more. I really didn't get it. So I stayed on to study more. And it took me at least 15 years to even begin to talk about this faith, and it's still very difficult for me to articulate. And so I'm really appreciative of this opportunity today. And as my bio said, I'm studying to be a spiritual director. I'll be commissioned in May. I've been reading all kinds of books by Catholic priests and learning about Lectio Divina and a whole new world of mysticism, and the whole history of spiritual exploration and connection to God is being opened up to me, and also connecting me back to my Quaker roots. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucia. That was wonderful. Our next speaker today is Ed Casper, who is an SGI Buddhist. That stands for Soka Gakkai International. He has spent many productive years in the insurance and real estate fields, aiding people in financial planning, home purchases, and sales. Ed is one of the longest serving members of the Arizona Interfaith Movement Board of Directors. His religious journey has led him from his Christian upbringing to being a faith-practicing Soka Gakkai International Buddhist. Please help me welcome Ed.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Mitzi mentioned, I grew up as a Christian. I was actually a Roman Catholic. And I was a pretty devout Roman Catholic. I was so devout that I was an altar boy for about 50 of the 52 weeks every year. The priest literally had to kick me off the altar to get me to not serve Mass. And if you've ever been to a Catholic service, there's usually two people that help the priest out in the ceremony. So I was one of those folks. My parents were in a mixed marriage. Going back to one of our former topics, of course, we talked about what happens with the kids in a mixed marriage. And my father was Catholic, and so I was raised Catholic. So I went largely to Catholic schools. There were some public schools mixed in because we were in small towns that didn't have a Catholic school. And I went to a Catholic high school. Then I went to college at DePaul University in Chicago, which is a very well-known Catholic institution. And had, and from what I understand, still has a very highly respected theology department. And so as part of our requirements to graduate, we had to take philosophy and theology classes. And of course I was glad to do that. It was something that was interesting to me. At DePaul, I took a course called Contemporary Religious Thought, which was taught by a Lutheran minister who was an adjunct faculty member. You have to remember, this is the late 60s. So the idea that a Lutheran minister was teaching at a Catholic university was something that was rather new to me. Now, maybe it had been done at DePaul for a long time. It was a pretty open school. So again, I'm not sure about that, but this is a long time ago. Well, what was interesting to me, that as we kept going along the course, it started with people like Nathan Serbian, who talked about how the living God is present in all religions, which again, given the upbringing as a Catholic, was a little bit odd to hear. And as he got into the class, he talked about the God is dead theologians. And of course, he made a point that these God is dead theologians are indeed theologians because they're studying about God, even though God is dead. But he made his case so vigorously and so well, I had to go out after class and ask him, do you believe in God? And he told me honestly that he did not believe in God. Now I wasn't even quite 20 at that point. And that was a bit of a surprise to me, that a Lutheran minister would believe in God. Knowing what I do now, it doesn't surprise me as much, because I've run into a number of people of many different faiths who are questioning whether God exists, or at least this, the old idea of God. Certainly the idea of what God is evolving all the time. And I wish I knew then what I do now, because it would have been a fascinating discussion with this man. He was a very, very good teacher. He had this interesting habit of blowing on his chalk all the time. But he was a very good teacher. It was a very good course. You know how you hear scuttlebutt when you're in college, how, this teacher's lousy, this teacher's really good. But this guy always came highly recommended. It was a really good class. But that got me to thinking about this, about my upbringing, and said, The other problem I was running into at the time is that what I was hearing in class and what I was hearing from the pulpit were very different in many ways. There was an openness in class that was missing from the pulpit. In some ways, it was like we're being talked down to. And I think that a lot of that has changed. Again, this is quite a while back. So I started to really question my beliefs. And I really do want to say that at this point that I want to thank everybody who got me to doing that, because it's a useful exercise. Well, I didn't storm out of the Catholic Church. I just quit going to Mass and became a nun. Spelled N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. Interestingly, I was at that point a part of what is now the fastest growing religious demographic in the country, which is none of the above, or unaffiliated. And if you look at the breakdown by age, the none of the above in the under 20 age bracket is over 20%. It's 26% in that bracket. So it's a very much a growing trend, as Mitzi alluded to, the 20% who change. So I was a nun for about 14 years, and I may have stayed that way, except that I ran into a lady at work who had this book called Fundamentals of Buddhism on her desk, and I always had a passing interest in Buddhism, because from the time I was exposed to it in my sophomore or junior Catholic school religion class, or the priest who taught the class talked a lot about Buddhism, and sounded like he knew what he was talking about. And as I got to practice more, I think he must have encountered the SGI, because a lot of what he said has a lot of the same variations of Buddhism that the SGI practices. Well, so I went to a meeting to check it out. So my conversion was a very slow process. There was no epiphany. I didn't have a sudden jolt of enlightenment while riding on the road to Damascus. I'm not sure if that's a very good analogy, but it's the best one I can think of. But contrary to the title of the topic, I didn't find God again. As my common centrist way would indicate, I sort of split the difference. I started practicing Nichiren Buddhism with the Soka Gakkai International, as Mitzi so well pronounced it, because people tend to butcher that name quite a bit. Soka Gakkai translates from the Japanese as value-creating community. The reason that I say I split the difference is because Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. There is no creator deity in it. Okay? In fact, the existence of God, or the question of God, is immaterial to Buddhists. It has nothing to do with the practice of Buddhism at all. In fact, many Buddhists debate, especially here in this country, debate whether it's really a religion or a philosophy. So it's an open question. And that's probably why most Buddhists refer to our practice as a practice. That's what it is, it's a practice. So over the years, my Buddhist practice has changed me in many different ways. One of the major ones is that I realized that for me at least, the change comes from within. And how one deals with life challenges is one's own responsibility. This is the way that Nichiren put it. Though worldly troubles may arise, never let them disturb you. No one can avoid problems, not even sages or worthies. Suffer what there is to suffer, enjoy what there is to enjoy. Regard both suffering and joy as facts of life. You may not believe this, but at one time in my life I was very, very shy. And for those people who know me, that's probably very hard to believe.
1 minute.
While I'm still am to some extent, I'm now much, much more comfortable with people. But most importantly, I'm now comfortable with who I am as a person. And maybe that's just an advantage of getting older, but I really do feel that my practice has aided that process. And so did my mother. A number of years back, she said, you really have been helped by your Buddhist practice. which I thought was an interesting affirmation. So again, in closing, my experience has shown me that questioning one's preconceived notions is a good idea. Even if you stay with where you were, you're going to have a lot better understanding of it and be much more grounded in it. And if you do change, at least it'll be informed choice. So I look forward to your questions when we get there, and so I'll turn back the floor to Mitzi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that. It just asked Ed to close the doors for us, so it was distracting when our final panelist speaks. But for right now, we have Shelly Corzo Schaefer, who is a Christian. She was born in Cuba and raised to be an atheist. She came to the United States in 1980 and became an evangelical Christian in 1992. Shelly is a teacher. She is married and has 2 young children. And she currently attends Living Streams, a non-denominational church. Please help me welcome Shelly.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and share the story of my conversion. I enjoyed talking about that experience because up to today it has been the most significant day of my life. As she said, I grew up in Cuba in the 70s, and Cuba at that time was an atheistic country. It had not always been atheistic, but the revolution of 1959 had ushered in the presidency of Fidel Castro. Now, his presidency quickly became permanent, and as he aligned his government's ideology with the Soviet Union, Cuba moved from being predominantly a Catholic country to being a Marxist, atheist country. Cuba adhered to the philosophy of Karl Marx, and Marx believed that religion was the opiate of the people, and that it was used by society as a means to enforce class systems by capitalistic societies. And he also believed that people had invented religion in order to cope with their material alienation. And he believed that once people's material needs were met, people no longer had a need for religion. So in Cuba, the revolution took on the task of moving people from being a people of faith to being a country of non-belief. So between 1965 and 1967, religious people in Cuba were sent to forced labor camps where they were going to be re-educated to become a new man for the revolution. They had to work in the sugarcane fields and had to endure hard labor until they confessed that there was no God, and then they would be allowed to join society again. Religious people at this time in Cuba were marginalized, and they were often ridiculed publicly, and they were not allowed to belong to the Communist Party. Now in Cuba, the only way that you can obtain a job, or you could at that time, was to belong to the Communist Party. The only way that you could go on as a student and obtain a higher education was if you were a member of the Communist Party. So by not being allowed to join the party, they were basically blocked from being part of society. Religious people were very marginalized in Cuba at that time. So as religious people were being educated in Cuba, my generation was being exposed to the beliefs of the government and the propaganda that the government put forth at the schools and at the media. In Cuba, basically, all the information is owned by the state. You're not allowed to read books that are not sanctioned by the government, and books and magazines from the United States were banned. And if you were caught in possession of such illegal goods, you could be sent to jail. At the time of the revolution, my father was also very young, and after being educated at the Catholic, he became an atheist, and he would tell me a story. Now, I don't know if my dad witnessed this or if he heard an account of it, but he would repeat the story often. Apparently, there were some revolutionary soldiers fighting against the resistance, and this took place on a busy street, and the resistance soldiers ran to the church to seek cover, from the revolutionary soldiers, and the priests at the church shut the doors, and the soldiers were killed at the door of the church, and my father would always tell me that story and tell me how bad religious people were. So by the time I was in 5th grade, I had been exposed to enough teachings by the government, and I had heard my dad's story often enough that I had made up my mind that I was an atheist, and I believed that God did not exist. I believed that people that peddled religion were manipulative, and they were trying to indoctrinate you. They were being fooled into believing something that was an illusion. So I considered myself too smart to be a religious person. When I moved to the United States in 1980, I was 11, and I already had enough the teachings in me to be a pretty strong atheist, I guess. As I grew, I continued to adhere to my beliefs, and when I went to college, I would debate with Christians on the existence of God or the non-existence of God with clever arguments, and I just thought, you know, there was no way that I was going to question my beliefs. I got married to my high school sweetheart, and our marriage began to fall into problems. So we began to have difficulties in our marriage. So at that time, I was very young and idealistic, and I had tried everything that I could in my power to save my marriage. We had attended marriage workshops, and we had gone to counseling, and we had done all the things that we could do to empower ourselves and make our marriage better, to no avail. At that point, I became very frustrated, and one of my friends invited me to go to church, and at this point I was pretty much in love, and I was desperate to save my marriage, if you will, and I went to church. I was pretty convinced that nothing was going to happen, but I thought I would give it a try, so I went to church that night, and something pretty miraculous began to happen, because as I was sitting there listening to the sermon, I realized that I had never even considered the possibility that there was a God. I had always believed that there wasn't a God, and I had been taught to believe that there wasn't a God, but I had never approached the topic from the opposite end, I guess, if you will. So that night, I guess what I did was pray, and sitting at that church, I had a conversation with God, and I said, God, I don't believe in you, and I don't really think you're real, but if you show yourself to me in a way that I could be convinced, not through, through teachings or people's, comments, but if you show me that you are real, then I will believe in you, and I guess I will follow you all the days of my life. And that night, full of suspicion and just being very suspicious of what was going to happen, I guess I prayed and I asked God to come into my life, and something very miraculous happened. The best that I can explain is that I had a knowing in my heart that God was real, and it was a very powerful conversion because I went from not believing in God and being an atheist to having an assurance in my heart that God existed and that He was real. Now, at that time in my life, my parents were heavy drinkers, and my home life was not that great. So we had come to the United States, and we were very poor. My parents drank a lot, and I remember as a young child wishing that my parents wouldn't drink anymore and that my life would be different. Well, that night, as I became a Christian, two things were, I guess, revealed in my heart, or I knew in my heart. One of them was that God was real, and the next was that my parents would not drink again. Well, sure enough, a few months later, my parents became Christians, and my dad, who had been an atheist, had a pretty strong conversion, and I continued from that point on to attend church. Now, there have been points in my life where I've questioned everything about my life, especially in 2000 when my husband passed away, and it was very difficult, but I have never ever questioned the existence of God after that. And I'm very happy that I made that choice and that I was able to overcome all my early teachings and give God a chance in my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelly, for sharing that really fascinating story about growing up in Cuba. So our next speaker is Mardick, Humanist. Anne is a retired telecommunications professional with 27 plus years experience. She was raised in a moderately religious Christian home. The family regularly, I don't know what's wrong with my speaking today, it's interesting, attended a congregational church where she sang in the choir. During her preteen years, she joined a youth Bible study group in addition to regular church attendance. In her later teens, she began to study other religious beliefs. Today, as an adult, Anne is an atheist and a humanist celebrant, which is a minister. Her passion is to educate people about the value of science, critical thinking, skepticism, separation of church and state, social justice, and to celebrate the diversity of humanity and nature. She is the founder and president of both the Greater Phoenix chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the Valley of the Sun chapter of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. She also serves on the board of the Arizona ACLU, the Secular Coalition for Arizona, Intrinsic Dignity, and the Arizona Interfaith Movement, representing humanism. Anne is a life member of the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix, the American Humanist Association, the National Center for Science Education, and the Council for Secular Humanism. Please help me welcome Anne Mardick.
Hi. Yes, in my early years, when we moved to Tucson in 1960, all through my grade school and all through junior high school, we regularly attended our church. And as I say, I was part of the choir and also attended Bible study groups. So the other thing is even though we were not Catholics, we were Congregationalists, I always wanted to be a nun. I don't know why, I just felt that being a nun would be the perfect thing. And I loved all the movies that were about nuns or saints, people who had given up everything to have a path for a wonderful life. So now, in my high school years, actually before my high school years, I always was bothering my mother to find out what the truth was. So whether it be about the tooth fairy, or she finally revealed to me about that there is no Santa Claus. In fact, I bugged her one day so badly to tell me the truth about how babies were made. She had told me the stork story, and she had told me this, and she had told me that. And finally, I said, no, but how? But how? And I said, you do what? And when she told me, I was so horrified. I was angry with her for about a week. But anyway, I was constantly looking for the truth. And it was strange to me because it was always when you got old enough, things would be revealed to you. So things went away, like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and, all the stork and those kinds of stories. So when I got into high school, I started having questions. The stories, there are a lot of inconsistencies in the Bible, and I had heard other kinds of things. And so I was always trying to get my mother, okay, it's good. I'm old enough now. You can tell me that there isn't a God, and I won't, run off and pillage, rape, burn, become a horrible human being. It's okay, I'm old enough. But she would never crack on this one particular subject. And I found that other people would not either. But when I probed them about what it was that they really believed, a lot of people hadn't really thought about what it was that they did believe or they didn't believe. Was the God, were you able to talk to him and he would really change things? Or was he someone that just set something in motion? All of those kinds of things. So through high school, my attendance in church faded until eventually I wasn't going to church at all. But on the thing about the religion, that no one would ever, what I considered to be come clean about this whole thing, because obviously some of these things I felt could not be real. And I always had a suspicion that what other sorts of conspiracies were there that people would not talk about. You know, what kind of other things were hidden from people. So anyway, when I got into college, of course, that was a real eye-opener, because then you take things like humanities and you learn that some of the greatest thinkers were free thinkers, and that were very critical of the church and what religion had done. And yet they were still great men, or great people, and had done really good things. So for me, that was an affirmation that I was okay, that there really was a whole body of knowledge and of thought that had to do with being good, but not associated with godliness. And the other thing was I studied anthropology, and in the study of anthropology, you look at many cultures going all the way back from the most primitive to even modern day cultures, and there's many similarities about the role that religion plays in there. One of them is to help kind of control the masses, if you will, because there is something greater that is going to keep you in line. In other words, that you must be good to avoid running afoul of the deities, so to speak. And usually whatever ruler there was, the rulers always claimed that they had the gods on their side. So that was the way they were able to maintain their control and that kind of thing. So I began to see why it was naturally that these things kind of occurred. But was okay with not having that. All through my working years, I was always very open that I did not believe in God, but when I say open, if somebody asked me about it. However, in the last few years, for example, when the president said that someone could not be an American, Bush said that you couldn't be an American if you didn't believe in God. And the recent rise of certain fundamentalist beliefs that a person who did not believe in a God was amoral. In other words, there are a lot of people, I'm sure you all have heard this, that we are all unhappy, atheists are unhappy, curmudgeons who live alone, that are cranky and just basically unhappy people, and they have no morals. But of course this is ridiculous, because even if you have a faith in God, and someone were to demonstrate to you positively that there was no God, none of us are going to run out and run afoul and go steal and that kind of thing. It's just not in our nature. So I began to be more of an activist about these things, especially some of the thoughts about science, anti-science, and that kind of thing. So I'm a firm believer of the separation of church and state. And the reason for that is this is the only way that all of us can live in a peaceful world, or coexist, I should say, together, is where government is concerned, government is neutral, because government controls all of us. And in that way, you can believe as you believe, and I can believe as I believe, and yet we can all be happy together. Also, I wanted to say that looking back now about why I wanted to be a nun, now when I look back on that, I realize is that there really aren't that many ways in society, roles that people can play out where you can be good. And you're just known as a good soul kind of a thing. And that's really what I wanted. It wasn't so much that I loved God, it's that I wanted to do good things and I wanted to be recognized for doing good things. And so I think that was the reason why I was so excited about being a nun. When I first heard about humanism, which is basically being good without God, I read, there's basically a paragraph about what the belief system is, and I said, that's what I am. And so that's how I became a humanist. And I'm none of those things about being unhappy and cranky. And and I do live with a good moral life. So thank you. Thank
you. Thank you, Anne. We don't think you're curmudgeonly at all. We see you are very smiley and welcoming and inviting. Ahmad Daniels, Muslim, is our next speaker. He is a transformational facilitator and life coach, and he is a Muslim. He has over 20 years of experience in community outreach programs, diversity training, and African American history. He's the founder of Creative Interchange, an organization whose mission is to enhance personal community and social capital through changed philosophies, personal empowerment, and self-actualization. Mr. Daniels was recognized by Community Pride magazine, December 2000, Charlotte's African American magazine, as one of Charlotte's 50 most influential black men. Mr. Daniels is most proud of being recognized by the editorial staff of the Charlotte Observer as a hero of democracy in July 2001, and for having played an active role in the United Nations World Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held late August, September 2001 in Durban, South Africa. His website is creativeinterchange.com. Please help me welcome Ahmad.
It was historian William Faulkner who reminded us that history is never dead. It isn't even past. It was when I joined the Marine Corps in 1966 as a Christian, right after high school. I was stationed in Millington, Tennessee for aviation training to become a jet mechanic. I would put on my uniform every Sunday and walk to the base on church and was welcomed by everybody there. One Sunday, however, I got this idea to go to the church outside of the base. And as I walked in, I was met by a very hostile white voice that said, "Get your black ass out of there." I had never experienced racism before, having been born and bred in New York City, ran track, dated people who were white. It was no problem with me. But that epiphany that I had that day prompted me to go to some place I had never been before as an enlisted Marine, and that's to the library. And it was in the library I read Crisis in Black and White by Charles A. Silverman, Who Speaks for the Negro by Robert Penn Warren, and Richard Wright's White Man Listen. And I met Malcolm X in those books. I met Eldridge Cleaver, Dr. King, Kwame Nkrumah, Haile Selassie. I met a host of figures whose names I had never heard of before. And when I began to think about my role as a black Marine going to Vietnam to have to possibly kill yellow people and not being able to attend a white church, it was a disconnect there. I felt out of aviation school, I became so disillusioned I didn't care anymore, and now I'm at Camp Pendleton, California, where Marines are preparing to go to Vietnam. It's also the summer of 1967 with tanks rolling down the streets of Newark and Detroit. And if any of you know anything about 50 caliber machine guns, this is what they had positioned on the turrets of all these tanks. And I knew from my having fired a 50 cal, all it would take was one round to go through a wall, tear off someone's head, and that same bullet would continue through another wall, tearing off someone else's arm. And I began to ask myself, why should I go to Vietnam and fight yellow people and then have to come back and fight white people in my own neighborhood. So I started going to the mosque at that time of the Nation of Islam. And if you know anything about the Nation of Islam, you've probably heard the name Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Minister Louis Farrakhan. And as I began to listen to what they were saying, I began to realize that religion exists to address the social needs of a people. It has very little to do with pie in the sky. It has to do, if you're hungry, how does it feed you? If you have needles in your arms, how does it pull the needles out of those arms? If your women are on the streets as prostitutes, how does it yank them from the streets and put them in a more decent way of looking at life? And that became my ideas of what I would be. Now, at this time, I was also telling all the black Marines we should not go to Vietnam. And finally, after my saying that enough, I received a military court-martial, was sentenced to 10 years and a dishonorable discharge. It was while I was incarcerated in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I began to realize others were coming back from Vietnam for rape, maiming, cutting off ears, disfiguring the human body, and none of them had 10 years. And I began to say, what is it about my opening my mouth that the military was more fearful of than you raping and killing and maiming? So I started writing people. I finally wrote the ACLU, and they began representing me. And after 2.5 years of incarceration, I received an honorable discharge. You cannot be a member of the Nation of Islam while you're in the military. So it was when I got out in 1970 that I did join the Nation of Islam. I needed that understanding of who I was at that time. I did not know I was a black man. I thought I was a Negro. I had no pride in who I was, but the Nation of Islam was there to uplift my being who I was, my telling me who I was, and giving me a sense of purpose of what my life consisted of. I stayed with the Nation for about 7 years, and if you know anything, I said this before, but I'll say it again, many African Americans who are now Sunni Muslims, if they're old enough, if they're baby boomers like myself, they went first through the Nation of Islam. It's a way of learning and fulfilling and filling the void that's so vitally important for black people. Many blacks do not know who they are. The schools won't teach you. If there's not some program that exists after schools or on the weekends, you'll go through life having a sense of there are no contributions, because the history books certainly fail to speak of the contributions. And I don't mean contributions that began here in the United States. I'm talking about contributions that began back in Egypt with Imhotep and Akhenaten and some of the great ones who lived during the Nile Valley civilization. So that became my experience. Having become a Sunni Muslim years later, it gave me more of a balanced and a central approach to what Islam is all about. It allowed me, during the many times I've been to Africa, the many times I've been to various parts of Europe, to go to the mosque when I wanted to and fit right in. It was Islam that allowed me to see that people can pray alongside of one another. It was that white church that told me that that was not possible. Now, being 18 years old at that time, I realize in retrospect now that it wasn't anything to do with Christianity. It was just the racism, white supremacy of that particular church. But I was young and I did not have time to get into any sociological, economic, philosophical debate with myself as to why white people were not allowing me to pray alongside of them. Islam stayed my religion up until this very day. I am at a place right now where I do not lead with my religion, and I never have led with my religion. There's something about Islam, unlike Jehovah's Witnesses, where they do not believe in proselytizing. You will not find us knocking on doors, endeavoring to convert you to the faith. We educate by example. I've become more of a spiritual person now than I am a religious person. I go to the mosque every now and then. If asked what my faith is, I will say Islam. If further probed, I'll come out and say that I'm more of a spiritual person than anything else. Faith must address the social needs of a people. If it's just dealing with pie in the sky reality, it fails the people. And I'm reminded of what the young lady said on the right side of me, that what Karl Marx said, that religion is the opium of the oppressed. There's never been a people I feel more religious than black people, particularly during the time of enslavement. The atrocities were so severe that we had to face and point towards something greater than ourselves. So religion began to be a big part of who we were. As we matured, as we began to learn more about ourselves and our reality, I believe religion still plays that part, but you still have other people like myself and others like Muhammad Ali who will ask the question, what is the role of religion? How does it make me the best person I could possibly be? How does it take my head out of the sky and help me to address the needs that are before me each and every day, 24/7? So I take a lot of pride in those whites who told me to get my black ass out. Because had they not told me to get out, I would have probably gone to Vietnam. And my name would have been on that wall, on that memorial in Washington, D.C., that I visit from time to time, because the names of those I counseled unsuccessfully, many of those names are engraved on that wall. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you, every panelist. That was fascinating. And it's almost time for us to turn it over to you, but as I spoke